Moral panics are scary. Consider for instance the witch hunts that occurred in the early modern period in Europe and North America. Estimates vary on how many so-called witches were executed by the Inquisition, but we are arguably talking about tens of thousands of people, mostly women, that suffered this fate in the hands of religious zealots that were in power. Moral panics are also intriguing, and the concept is well established in academia, having first been introduced there by sociologist Stanley Cohen in the late 1960s. It became the carrying theme for his famous book on the subject called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. Cohen defines moral panic as a condition caused by something or someone becoming perceived as a threat to societal values and interests. By folk devil, he means those perceived as the threat, something conceptually similar to the idea of scapegoat. While people no longer talk of witches under their breath as a demonic menace in need of purging, hysteria caused by the concept of pedophilia is not completely dissimilar in its effects, and it's hardly far-fetched to perceive pedophiles as modern folk devils. Up next, I'll introduce 5 instances in which our perfectly sensible drive to protect children from sexual predators turned nastily against ourselves or otherwise attained ridiculous proportions in the form of detrimental pedo-hysteria. We start off with something called daycare sex abuse hysteria, which occurred between the 80s and the 90s and was an offshoot of the satanic panic. It affected predominantly the USA, although it did spread to other Western societies too, for example New Zealand and a few European countries. A typical instance of daycare sex abuse hysteria involved accusations of sexual abuse of children against daycare center workers. These allegations tended to be wild and fantastical in nature, and more often than not incorporated elements of satanic ritual abuse. The ensuing criminal investigations frequently expanded well beyond their initial scope, with sometimes dozens of suspects being identified as allegedly linked to heinous crimes, the proof of which almost invariably remained elusive and unreliable. For instance, in what became known as Martinsville satanic sex scandal in 1992, a Canadian parent accused a woman in charge of a babysitting service of sexually abusing her child. The investigations, fueled by rampant allegations, expanded, and ultimately more than a dozen individuals, some of whom were police officers, became defendants accused of horrendous offenses. Namely, they weren't solely accused of abusing children sexually, but also of doing this as part of a satanic ritual and as members of a devil-worshipping cult called the Brotherhood of the Ram. However, a subsequent inquiry found that the initial investigation had been motivated by emotional hysteria, but the harm was already done, as the son of the babysitting service had already been tried and found guilty. Later in 2004, however, a compensation package amounting to $1.5 million was distributed among the victims of the malicious and wrongful persecution. Now, I feel one cannot truly understand daycare sex abuse hysteria without appreciating the impact of the poor investigation techniques that were at use. To illustrate, in 1985, a daycare teacher named Margaret Kelly Michaels was sentenced to 47 years in jail for allegedly molesting multiple children. The court had been convinced by the prosecution's evidence that nearly all of the children in the nursery school evinced symptoms of molestation. However, her conviction was afterwards overturned by appeals court, as the trial hadn't been fair and the investigation had been done poorly. In fact, the interviews of the alleged victims had included elements of suggestion and coercion. On top of that, the testimony should have been dismissed also because it relied too heavily on a pseudoscientific theory called the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. The model posits that effectively any answer given by a child to a question about potential sexual abuse, whether affirmative or dissenting, must be interpreted as a sign that abuse in fact transpired. Even though this theory allows the child no opportunity whatsoever to communicate that abuse never happened, which sort of nullifies the whole purpose of the interview, the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome model was at its peak popularity during the Satanic Panic, seeing wide application in similar criminal investigations. This fact, coupled with poor understanding of the concept of false memories, meant that prosecution then was often highly successful and produced wrongful convictions. In some instances, the daycare sex abuse hysteria escalated into sheer vigilantism. In Brazil in 1994, when the police irresponsibly gave out information about their ongoing investigation, vigilantes looted and destroyed a school because the suspects comprised of its staff. In this case, the investigation was closed for lack of evidence. In many others, allegations ultimately turned out false and convictions were overturned. But justice prevailed only partially, as lives were already ruined by the false accusations. Even though one is cleared of all charges of child molestation, the label and association to something so devious may last for a lifetime, not to mention the years wasted by some while being wrongly imprisoned. But what then caused the daycare sex abuse hysteria? Sociologist Katherine Beckett argues that as society was rapidly changing in the sense that more and more mothers were working away from home and consequently had to leave their children in the care of strangers, in this climate their fears and apprehensions festered, resulting in a willingness to believe false accusations. The next incident of Ped0hysteria expands on the theme of vigilantism and false labeling. The case of Bijan Ebrahimi demonstrates that being wrongly labeled as a pedophile or a child molester can quite literally mark the end of your life, as this was the reason he was beaten to death in 2013 by a couple of vigilantes. It all began when Ebrahimi, who lived in Bristol, UK, photographed a few youths who were vandalizing his garden. It so happens that gardening was one of the greater joys of this disabled and unemployed person. Hence, taking pictures of these malicious individuals desecrating his flowers to be handed to the police as evidence should seem understandable enough. But alas, Ebrahimi couldn't divine that in his neighborhood his act would brand him as a flaming pedo, a rumor that would spread henceforth with ultimately lethal effect. It may be of some value to note here a parallel to the aforementioned witch hunts of the past that also seem to affect mostly the type of people who were abnormal in some respects, people who would stand out from the crowd, but I digress. When Ebrahimi was taken into custody by the police following a confrontation between him and the vandals, who apparently kept coming back, the crowd chanted "pedo, pedo," something that probably should have signaled to the authorities this mob might pose a threat to Ebrahimi. While arrested, the authorities confirmed that the images he took of the youths were not inappropriate and nothing besides indicated there was any truth value to the rumors. Still, after 2 days of Ebrahimi's release, his then 25-year-old neighbor Lee James put into action what he had threatened to do earlier and took the law into his own hands. He beat up Ebrahimi to death, and then, with the aid of another vigilante neighbor, Stephen Norley, burned his body using white spirit as fuel. Later, when caught, the vigilantes admitted the crime. According to a BBC article, James told the police he kicked Ebrahimi like a football. James was jailed for life for murder, and Norley had to serve for 4 years for assisting in the act. This case is disturbing not only because of these two assailants on their moral crusade against an imaginary folk devil, but also because how useless the police were in doing anything to provide protection to Ebrahimi, who had made multiple calls to them in the span of his last 2 days. This is how Ebrahimi's relatives describe him in their statement. He was a quiet, disabled man whose only joys in life came from his horticultural interest and his cat. Bijan was a caring, loving and unselfish man. He was an excellent uncle and a warm, supportive brother. As this story was so horrific, let us take a look at something very different now, an older one perhaps in this list. It showcases moral panics need not have extreme consequences. They can simply stir in the form of casual, under-the-breath disapproving of behavior that is at variance with our perception of normality, in this case within the family unit. Around 2015, a Danish comedian, Torben Chris, shared this picture of himself bathing with his 2-year-old daughter. While there certainly are reasons why you might want to abstain from sharing images of this sort, Chris had a very specific rationale for doing so, and to understand it, let us start from the beginning. During those times, Chris hosted a show, the name of which sadly is beyond my Danish pronunciation skills, but which anyhow commented critically on the uptight attitudes towards nudity by his fellow countrymen. After one episode, Chris started receiving posts from parents relating instances when they had been frowned upon for ordinary expressions of intimacy with their children. For instance, apparently there exist people so audacious to call a parent a pedophile for bathing with his small child, or to insinuate in similar vein if one should share an image showing French braid on his 11-year-old daughter's bare back. Shortly afterwards, Chris posted the aforementioned image of himself bathing with his toddler in protest against this kind of moral hysteria. Although the vast majority of people were supportive of Chris, there were dissenting views too, with one person righteously proclaiming, "The only person who isn't thinking straight is you and your types. You're sitting there with your legs spread out in front of a 2-year-old girl. Doesn't it feel wrong?" Now, Chris also made more direct statements regarding this, such as these two. "There's nothing wrong with a father who washes his daughter's bottom and vagina when she's a child. On the contrary, it is bloody disgusting if nobody does it, and unfair if only the mother does it. Nudity with your child's not cross, but natural. A father in the shower with his daughters, not pedophilia, it's fun." While you could perhaps critique Chris for thinking a bit too dichotomously and appealing to nature here, he does raise the valid point about the double standard, that women seem a bit more free to do these same things. And finally, another aspect worth mentioning is that as much as there is heterogeneity within countries as regards views on nudity, this certainly is also true between them. Compare, for example, the USA and a country like Finland, where traditionally the whole family goes to sauna together naked, something the American would probably feel queasy about. And that is fine, but to dangerously label someone because of your queasiness, that is another matter. Speaking of dangerousness, the next instance illustrates an interesting societal dilemma, namely that of our society having the balance between on the one hand upholding academic freedom and on the other hand countering dangerous ideas with real bad consequences. We can trace the start of the so-called Rind et al. Controversy to July 1998, when the Psychological Bulletin, which is ran by the American Psychological Association, published a study on child molestation titled "A Meta-Analytic Examination of Assumed Properties of Child Sexual Abuse." This meta-analysis by Bruce Rind, Robert Boserman, and Philip Traumovich would go down as one of the most controversial academic pieces in the field, because its conclusions are widely interpreted as an attempt to justify this particular crime. For many months, the Rind et al. Study didn't attract meaningful attention, except in a few fringe groups advocating for child abuse, such as NAMBLA, who used the findings of the paper as vindication for their cause. They also publicly thanked APA for, and I quote, having the courage to publish such a piece in their respectful magazine. But the harmony was not meant to last, for in March 22, 1999, a talk show host, Dr. Laura Schlesing, began bashing the study in her show, expressing her fear that it might be utilized to normalize pedophilia and bring about undesirable changes in the law. Immediately after, various news media such as the Washington Times and National Post were to pick up the story, publishing articles that rebuked APA for having published such pedophile propaganda, as they labeled it. Of course, all this had the unintended and ironic effect of drawing more and more attention to the blasphemous study. So eventually, as the shitstorm showed no signs of subsiding, on March 23rd, APA also had to make a stand in the form of an announcement unequivocally denouncing child molestation as harmful. APA also argued that using Rind et al. Study to claim otherwise is a misrepresentation of the findings, and their chief executive officer Raymond D. Fowler even defended the study in one debate, saying, "It isn't a bad study, it's been peer-reviewed." Nevertheless, and rather inconsistently, Fowler kind of backpedaled on June 9th when he admitted that APA had made mistakes during the reviewing process before publishing the article. He announced that for the first time in its 107 years history, APA would request an independent expert review of the scientific validity of Rind et al. Study. However, the American Academic for the Advancement of Science, which the APA had turned to, declined as they saw no reason to review an already peer-reviewed paper. What is also historic is that a bunch of politicians in a frenzy of moral righteousness got the whole of US Congress to formally denounce the report, something the US Congress had never done before as regards a scientific publication. Here are 2 excerpts on this. Now, therefore be it resolved by the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, that Congress third urges the President likewise to reject and condemn in the strongest possible terms any suggestion that sexual relations between children and adults, regardless of the child's frame of mind, are anything but abusive, destructive, exploitative, reprehensible, and punishable by law. Unfortunately, I couldn't ascertain from my sources whether President Clinton ever heeded this request to delve into this specific controversy, or was he, I don't know, busy running the country? Such a study by such a prestigious institution gives credibility and potential legal defenses to pedophiliac sickos. Despite the rather plebeian wording here, the point itself is sort of valid in that there were a few legal cases in which the defense of a child molester was partially based on the findings of said publication. And this is the other side of the coin. No matter how well the Rind controversy exemplifies a crude moral panic and displays the desire of some folks to suppress academic freedom, it is a real harm if the contents of a study help truly reprehensible offenders to escape legal punishment. This then raises the question, does the Rind study really advocate for child abuse? In short, the answer is not straightforward. These are, I believe, the central findings or conclusions put forth by the study. Firstly, the scale of maladjustment or trauma consequent to child molestation has been overestimated. Secondly, besides the sexual contact between a child and an adult per se, there are other moderators too at play, such as the use of force influencing to what extent a child is traumatized or maladjusted. Thirdly, there appears to be differences in how males and females on average react to molestation, relating for instance to the severity of the impact on adjustment. Fourthly, a suggestion is made that willing non-incestuous sexual encounters between kids and adults should probably be termed adult-child sex rather than child sexual abuse. While some of that sounds disquieting, it should be emphasized that the paper never implies that sex between adults and children does not pose a risk for serious harm, nor does the paper insinuate that kids could give informed consent in sexual matters. Finally, there's an important disclaimer at the very end of the report that many folks seem to have missed. Moral codes of a society with respect to sexual behavior need not be and often have not been based on considerations of psychological harmfulness or health. Similarly, legal codes may be and have often been unconnected to such considerations. In this sense, the findings of the current review do not imply that moral or legal definitions of or views on behaviors currently classified as ZSA should be abandoned or even altered. The current findings are relevant to moral and legal positions only to the extent that these positions are based on the presumption of psychological harm. In conclusion, since Rind and his colleagues never in the paper argue for the capacity of children to give informed consent to sex, this could constitute a moral reason to oppose child molestation even within the framework of this publication that otherwise seems to belittle the obvious harmfulness of the offense. Although it would make sense to discuss some of the academic critiques of the study at this point, this video is not deep dive into this, so let us move on to the last example of pedo-hysteria I have. It is a case that has haunted me ever since I learned about it. It is the case about Abigail Rae. On November 28, 2002, a 2-year-old Abigail Rae went missing in Britain. Through a door left open, she strayed away from her nursery school called Ready Teddy Go in Warwickshire. Her absence noticed, the nursery staff immediately began searching for the child. Shortly after, Abigail was spotted wandering along a village road by a bricklayer named Clive Peachy, but he drove past her. For a moment, just try imagine the predicament this tousle-headed child was in. She's lost, probably cold and scared, and no one around wants to help her. Upon hearing a missing child report, Peachy did contact the police to tell them about her though. At a later investigation, this is how he explained his inaction. I kept thinking I should go back. The reason I didn't was because I thought people might think I was trying to abduct her. He also kept telling himself that her parents are surely nearby and will find her. Her mother did find her, but we'll get to that later. The bricklayer obviously should have saved the girl, but his fears are not uncommon in people, especially men, and they're not entirely unfounded either. The following excerpt is from a 2012 Telegraph article. One study found that 75% of men admitted they would not help a child in distress for fear of what it might look like to others, says Goldberg. A total of 23% would ignore the child completely. The others would find a woman to assist. Interestingly, there was a social experiment about this in 2014. One little girl was clutching her favorite toy while her younger sister was sucking her thumb, and both looked utterly lost and forlorn. In a bygone era, a concerned adult might have stopped to ask them where their mother was, but in a damning indictment of modern Britain, hundreds of busy people simply walked on by. The girl stood for an hour on a Saturday morning in a busy shopping arcade looking for help as part of a social experiment for television. Hidden cameras recorded Uma, 7, and Maya, 5, who took it in turns to look lost. Astonishingly, over the whole hour, only one person, a grandmother, took a moment to find out if there was a problem. All of the 616 other passers-by completely ignored the girls. Now, these disturbing cases and statistics are about Britain, but this type of panic is more widespread. Consider this example from Illinois, USA. In brief, a man named Fitzroy Barnaby was found guilty of the unlawful restraint of a minor and put on a sex offender register just for having grabbed the arm of a 14-year-old girl while he was scolding her for having stepped right in front of his moving car. Sure, he went too far physically grabbing her to emphasize his message, but that probably still shouldn't constitute a sex offense. We're almost done, but not quite, because we are yet to close the story of little Abigail. What happened to her then? Well, she was found by her own mother, drowned in a local pond. To quote the ending of the Telegraph article, touching a child, even to render medical assistance, has become a potential police matter. Child abuse must be addressed, but it is worse than folly to punish those who help children. Our society is creating Clive Peachy, decent men who will walk away from a child in need. Abigail Rae died not only from drowning, but also from bad politics. Sadly, there probably is no easy fix for the bad politics, as they stem partially from people's natural propensity for scapegoating and moral panicking, which go back even further than the witch hunts, and weeding out instinctual behavior is notoriously difficult. But surely, to be aware of the psychology behind Ped0hysteria is the needed first step towards fixing it. Meanwhile, I hope at least that if somebody who watched this start having any qualms about stopping to help a strange child who is lost or distressed, they'll think about Abigail and they'll go and save that child. That's all I have. Thanks for listening.